Vukosi Marivate is the ABSA Chair of Data Science at the University of Pretoria. His PhD is in computer science, and he also studied a master's in undergrad in electrical engineering. So he works on developing machine learning and artificial intelligence methods to extract various insights from data. And I know one of the projects that he's talked to me about is the use of text and data mining on, for instance, newspapers and other forms of content in order to create natural language processing applications that convert text into various African languages. So he needs to access text that's created in Swahili or Zulu or in various forms to create these kind of machine learning tools that can just be so useful to other kinds of researchers as well. So it's one of these examples of a form of research that helps other researchers and connects to some of the copyright issues. Go ahead, Vukosi.
I'll give first a background on some of the things that my group does, and then a lot of other people also are trying to do in this space. So I'm in South Africa. South Africa has 11 official languages. If we exclude English and Afrikaans, which are better resourced languages, on there you then have these other 9 languages. One of the things that's the problem there is the languages might be well spoken, many speakers on the country, but they don't have a lot of digital resources. So that's a problem. So I work in artificial intelligence, and what we want to do is, hey, how do we build up tooling and models and come up with new approaches that allow more and more people to get access to information using their languages. So one, yes, is translation tools that are available online, and they've really changed over the last 2 decades. And one being because of more and more availability of general data of many languages. Let's put up a scenario. So in South Africa, there's a language called Int'l. It has 0 Wikipedia articles, so you can't get a Creative Commons licensed data set from Wikipedia. That's my wife's language. My father's language is Xitsonga. That's got, I think, 600 articles or something like that on Wikipedia. In that language, you have, I think, Sepedi in South Africa has 6,000. So you can see they're increasing, but that's not a lot. English has 6 million articles on Wikipedia. I find a German newspaper, and then I think, hey, this would be great if I could get access to that newspaper data and then convert it and translate it as well into a local South African language, because then this will allow me to train more models. Sometimes we might want to do mockups. We find a website that has data in Int'l, but then now what we want to do is do things like news categorization. So we're going to categorize every article, or I might want to do name entity recognition. So I will mark everything where there's a name of a person, a name of a organization, a name of a place. All of this is useful for machine learning algorithms later on in those languages, right? So you take it for granted that when you go into a search engine and you put in a name of a place, that the search results change, given that now they know that that's actually a location and that's not just a general query. But just imagine if that is not available in your language you're trying to build on. Having tools that can do metadata creation and all those things allows us to curate it better, make sure people can find the things that they want to find, but then it be in their language. Sure, most of the data is in English, then you figure out the translation. Hey, you might be interested in specific subsets, then you want to deal with identifying entities. You might want to do simplification. Our work is we're trying to figure out how to do that. One part on the data side, the other part on how can we use current AI to better do this. You can leverage other languages or other data to come in there. But ultimately, it always comes down to data. There's this paper called the unreasonable effectiveness of data, right? Of the more data you get, it's most likely you're going to have more advances than thinking that you'll do it via very clever algorithms or clever math. We're sitting in this situation where we are concerned that we might not have enough time for a lot of languages of making sure we're doing everything in the legal manner. because then if the AI methods are not being updated on that part, languages will die as we get into a more monolingual kind of internet. So what should we be doing? So the Botswana government has a website. And the interesting thing is that most of the content that they have on here is in English, but they have a section called Dikang. Dikang just means news in Setswana. So if you click on here, you will now see this news, and now it's written in Setswana. We want to build like one of these new large AI models for Setswana. So this is a great source to be able to use. Build up a scraper, have that data, it's probably sitting somewhere on my computer, and then build up these models, got it annotated, so hired a company, they read all of the articles, they gave them each a category or 2 categories, depending on what's going on. And now we want to make sure that when the paper becomes available, the data plus the annotations which we've created becomes available. So we ask for permission from the Botswana government. First, email nothing was going on, went onto Facebook, onto their Facebook, messaged them. I think it took a few weeks. They responded saying, we'll get back to you. A year goes by, go back to them again. Hey, what's going on? They don't respond, keep on asking, they don't respond. And now we're sitting in the situation where we don't know. We're thinking for, in this case, especially for the Botswana government, where this is the national language, this might be a very important thing to actually make available, because it's just a subset of what they have. It's their content, it's their copyright. It will be written in that way. The annotations are ours. We're releasing them under Creative Commons. But what do we do now? You get a feeling of you're stuck, or hey, we'll release, ask for forgiveness later, and hopefully you don't get sued on that. But then this is a reality that you face. The same thing in South Africa. We have a national broadcaster. They have radio stations in all 11 languages. You've got audio that's available that you could do with that. And in this case, you're thinking about also that they have a public mission, right? It's very different that if they were just their private organization. They're not. They're funded by taxpayers within there. And that's also not clear, especially in, hey, we're going to make this available. Again, maybe getting it easy. You can do that. But now what happens when you have to reshare? The South African government has the same thing. They have a newspaper that they release. What they do is that when an edition comes out, they only have a subset. So let's say if the main English one has 20 articles, maybe 3 or 4 of them are translated into a local language. And this also then is a limitation, right? If we could then take some of this data, they made it available in a machine readable way. It can be in just clear text or TXT, or it can be in XML, or it can be in JSON, something that's marked up that's much easier. It could make our lives easier, but then that's not what we currently have. Also, if they did this, we could then help with building translation systems that assist the translators that they work with, so that you can have a human and machine collaboration that makes it sure that, maybe we'll have 18 of the 20 articles now being translated, just because it doesn't cost as much as what it used to do. What our research group then went on to do, we're still doing this, to rebuild this data, but now in a clear text manner. So if you go here, you will see raw. We've downloaded all the PDFs. They're available on here up until maybe July this year, with all the back catalog until 2012. So if I open in here, you'll see there's the TXT file on a specific page. We wrote a little tool. So now it's not as clean. And then if you process it further, you go into processed and you open it. Now you'll see it in a much more cleaner way. There's the headline. We were checking who's the author. It's not named. And then this is the text that came from there. So it's slightly starting to get aligned. And then the thing is, if we have this, then it's aligned across all the languages, which is great, right? That's the thing that you want. So you can choose, for example, this was Afrikaans. I can choose and say, this is Ndebele, I think, and then it's the same text in different ways. So that's kind of what we're doing. I'll be going, hopefully in the next week or two, to go talk to our university. We have a special section that just deals with digitizing items into better formats than what they start with. So hopefully that'll work. Common Crawl is a web crawl of as many websites on the internet that could be crawled. And this gets made available. You can just download this data. You just need to have a computer that can actually get it. It's hosted on Amazon. And you basically, almost like you're republishing the internet in a multi-petabyte data set. So they can do this. Can we do it? Or what would happen if we did this? This data is used a lot in natural language processing. So not just for us in low resource settings, but everybody. We go into Common Crawl, you build something called a language identifying model. So it identifies what language a specific website might be in. And then you can filter all of Common Crawl for your languages and then get that data and then you use it. So now you can find that there's now Common Crawl that might be available in your language, and then you get that and then you use it in models. It brings up this question of power. Who's allowed to do this and who's not? There's large organizations outside my country that can most likely easily crawl many websites in the country, use that data, and in this case, even be republished, but they wouldn't be targeted as much as I would. But at the same time, I also am at a university, and the university has a good research legal team that I have access to, that I can go talk to. And I found other academics also across the African continent not having the same type of access. And that could be a very big problem. The social media companies, most of the models that they build are built for English. Languages outside that means that you're vulnerable. If you're in Ethiopia at the moment, in the Tigray, there might be a lot of misinformation that's spreading, and Facebook or Twitter not being able to do anything about it in terms of modeling, just because they don't have any tools for those languages. Not just that, they make a choice. I know Facebook, I think a few years ago, said they only spend 13% of their money that they budget for fighting abuse for context outside North America and really outside English. That should be scary, right? These are platforms where in some countries they are the internet. So if they're not able to identify this abuse, then it makes all of us a little bit unsafer. We had a local election last year. We were processing Twitter data, working right now on a presentation next week that I'll do at the African Investigative Journalism Conference on how we then try to think about heuristics on early warning systems. Sure, in South Africa, we can use the fact that a lot of the Twitter data will be in English. But then right now, some of my lab, through some of the things we've built for language identification, have been trying to filter the data we collected to then identify local language content and see if there might have been any campaigns that break our laws that happened and on there. The other thing that this creates is that you can't even check things correctly. So for example, if I'm in South Africa and I'm on Twitter and I see something that is not okay, it doesn't matter what the language is. When it comes to misinformation or disinformation, I do not have the option to report it. I fly into the US like I did in June. I was going to Boston, visiting Harvard. As soon as I landed, within a few seconds, my Twitter changes. Now I have an option to report misinformation, right? This is a very major challenge, and we need to figure out ways to kind of make sure that this tooling becomes available. And then it's also not just in English, because that's an easy way to then fool these types of systems going forward. Now I'm going to throw a spanner in the works here. We've been talking about large commercial entities, maybe as the newspapers. But then what happens, for example, now we have an indigenous newspaper that's small scale. It's run in a village with 40 or 50 people. How then do we now also protect them from also being able to gain from interest in the content that they create? For example, I would go create new content in my mother's language and my father's language. It's very easy for Google to come take it. They update their Google translation tool now, as my father's language didn't have it before. We started working on these spaces, but then we know that they're using the data that comes from it. And we're trying to see how do we work better with them within these spaces, but still knowing that there's this power asymmetry the other way on this one, which is, life is complicated, right? A few years ago, we used to have this data set that came from the Jehovah's Witnesses. They publish most of their religious news in many, many languages across the world. And what had happened is that in the NLP community, I think it was from the Netherlands, a lab had then aligned all of this data for translation. And for many, many languages, this was the largest data set that was available in their language. And what happened about 2 years ago, the Jehovah's Witnesses organization then got in touch with that lab and told them to remove it. All right. And this was a massive blow to the research now that's being done by many people. And right now, I think there's a lot of people who have this data on their laptops or their computers from before, and who's still allowed to continue working with it, and who's not becomes a question. And if now, let's say that becomes the last place that for one language that the data is available for that language and it's nowhere else, what is supposed to happen? 1,000 languages, resources for that just disappeared. There was no negotiation. There was no conversation. It was just almost cease and desist.
Some text and data mining exceptions say that the materials being used for text and data mining have to be lawfully accessed, and then some don't. So Mike Carroll's argument that he presented to us says, well, fair use doesn't require lawful access. As long as the use is lawful, it doesn't really matter where you got that information. So I think at least Michael Carroll would argue that those people holding Jehovah's Witnesses data on their computers could still use it because it's a lawful use of that data. And then, of course, there's the temporal access of lawful access. It was lawful when you accessed it, but then what happens if they take it down after? Does that affect whether you're lawfully accessing it in the first place? So those are some fun legal issues for the lawyers to figure out.
Because of having some of the problems of accessing some of the local language data, we also process like Facebook pages and Twitter pages of the broadcasters, for example. Like here, they would share headlines. So it's not the content, it's just the headline, and then there might be some other things. But then obviously you do see that there's comments, and then what we do is that for now, we don't touch anything on the comments. For us, it's not the important part, it's the headlines. And then those, we've been working on some of them to actually, again, in the same way we create a repository online that's available, we've marked them up, and then they become available. When we have the full articles and we're processing them, you expect in some ways that there's press codes that the newspapers have to abide by. So we're taking kind of that they've done that, and we're just kind of secondary processing what they have. But when we go to social media, which then comes down to ethical use of social media data. So when we do things like we're looking at Twitter data, which is slightly different, I guess, from a copyright perspective. I just thought it might be interesting to highlight. We do different things there. So one might be we only identify what we take as a public person. So there might be a politician, there might be a celebrity, and everybody else just becomes a random number within that data. So that if you have to show an example, we only show ones that come from those public persons. If we want to show something that might be interesting, like for example, was tied to, let's say, anti-vaccine, we can take steps like doing paraphrasing. So you show the person without their real name, you paraphrase the social media post just to get your point across of, oh, here's an example of something on there. Because if you show the text as it is, obviously it's very easy to go search and find out who that person is. And it's the same thing as putting their name out there. And there's many steps within there. This was a very long kind of debate, even within our university and University of Pretoria. We would submit for ethical clearance at the early days. And you also then have to go past what the limitations of the platform actually are. So with Twitter, for example, you're never allowed to republish in terms of online the original tweets. What you can do is you can provide people with the IDs of the tweets, and then this allows researchers to at least try to reproduce your work. But then there's still ethical things that we do beyond what's required by the platform. Some people might argue then it's like, oh, why don't you have licenses that allow for research use, saying you can use this for research that's non-commercial, whatever, and then after that, please talk to us. Like, that could be a clear thing. But the reason I'm saying it's going to come to a crescendo is because of what's happening with artificial intelligence in general, right? So now, as I said, people are doing common crawl. Initially thinking about common crawl was the text. Now there's the whole thing that you have these text to image models that are then trained on not just the images, and maybe people didn't care about how do we sort out the licensing then. It was, it's the text. Now it's the images, and even artists are coming back and saying, wait, somebody can go type in and say, I would like now a new painting by this painter who's long dead that now, is based in my village in South Africa, and then it gets painted. And who now owns that copyright? Obviously, it had to be trained. If it was trained, it means that images were processed that came from these large crawl sets, and then now we're sitting and going so who actually is at fault here? Because the thing that's being shared is no longer, obviously, we're not resharing the data that where it came from, we're resharing what the AI is now interpreting as what has come from that data. And that's the same thing that is going to be facing news in the same way. You do have already, you've had for more than a decade, systems that can now generate news text for some languages, just given some parameters. You could think about weather information is very dry, right? So all you need to do is provide a few parameters and say, here's what's happening tomorrow in the next 24 hours, and something can write 2 or 3 paragraphs automatically. The same thing with sports or economic factors on that. So now we're going, there's going to be this part of well, if you're now not doing that, and then other people are building on top of these things, I think that's where the fear comes from, right? That's exactly where the fear comes of now we don't even know how to control this, and we haven't really thought about how that's going to be controlled. And we might find ourselves on the other side where it's too late and there's nothing we can do. So instead of more not being fearful, but really trying to work together and finding some regime that at least allows, especially researchers, to do work within these spaces, be able to critique, I think, governments in ways just by looking at the facts and looking at what's being written. There is still a very important piece every time I work with journalists that I understand that they have to fill in on here on understanding what's going on with the people in power, what's going on with the citizens, and bridging that gap. Having them gone is not a good idea in many ways. But then we also must think about how do we assist by doing our research that we can identify these things. I'm working on misinformation, and I'm working with a media monitoring organization that's an NGO in South Africa, and that's important. But to do that work, we need access to this data. For us, there's preservation, there's creating new ways for people to access information, and especially also civic education. The reason I work on government news and all those things that provides information for people who might not be conversant in English, and also brings the parts of allowing cultural and indigenous knowledge to also transfer from people who speak in these local languages back to everybody else, because we miss out also on that part. There are concepts that just don't exist in these other languages, and they've got this knowledge that they have that they can't really share because it doesn't translate as well. So how do you do that? You make sure that they can interact with us with their language, and then be able to explain those things on that part. So that's, I think, when you're asking the social, the cultural. I did not start out of this. I was a machine learning person. I was in AI. I was enjoying my time, and then you end up starting to work in language, and then all these things kind of come with the territory.